They call me a killer, a monster, a terrorist. I'm all of these things.
Prototype's introduction makes a memorable first impression, but it will only pay off on half of it. The introductory cutscene, repurposed from the game's initial cinematics trailer, paints a dark and decaying New York City. Strange vines wrap around the rubble and abandoned cars that litter the street, meanwhile a Spec Ops squad slowly makes its way through the abandoned city. At the same time, it introduces the protagonist, Alex Mercer, and shows off some of the powers you'll be playing with in the hours to come. Seeing the squad fight off an ambush by zombies, executing the woman they saved from them, watching as Mercer tears them apart, it's a fantastic tone setter for a dark, conspiracy-laden thriller backed up with brutal violence, but the game won't manage to deliver on most of those promises as well as it would clearly like to. It will deliver on the promises made by the second half of the intro, dropping you into Times Square late in the outbreak, with access to a large range of Mercer's abilities, gives you a taste of the chaotic combat that will permeate the game. It also shows that having the player know what's happening is less important than having them think something will happen soon. The game struggles to maintain the balance between its ambitious conspiracy thriller plot with its high-octane superhero-inspired action. An open-world superhero game set in New York is likely to make some people think of the well-respected Spider-Man 2 for the 6th-gen consoles. But while the structure is similar, the powers available to Mercer make him feel more like the Hulk. This isn't surprising when you realise that developer Radical Entertainment had previously worked on several Hulk games. Beyond the basic power set letting you sprint up walls, jump over buildings, and toss cars into the upper atmosphere, all of which are great fun to play with, is a smorgasbord of varied abilities. Mercer's transformative powers gives you a great deal of freedom when dealing with foes, with a variety of claws, blades, fists and whips to switch between, alongside a variety of more traditional moves like punches, kicks, and of course elbow drops from the top rope, though in this case the top rope may be the spire of the Empire State Building. The combat in Prototype is an undeniable blast, but as your options increase and you become more powerful, it detracts from the potential of the rest of Mercer's skill set. Alex can consume any living thing around him. Doing so regains his health, grants him their memories, and lets him transform into them. Some of these are well integrated. Turning both enemies and passing civilians into a healthy snack mid-fight is almost as much fun as using them as anti-helicopter projectiles. Meanwhile, the memory transfer is used both as a way to point you towards objectives and in gaining skills relating to military equipment. The transformations, however, don't fit as well into the game's focus. Since you can't use any of your more exotic combat abilities while using another body, it's only really useful for ending combat once you break line of sight to the military, or for stealth segments. The stealth mechanics are undercooked to say the least, and the game repeatedly needs to come up with excuses for you to engage with them, since you quickly hit the point where kicking the door down and murdering everyone would be a much quicker solution to any problem. Even when engaging with them, they aren't particularly complex. Some bases have sensors which can slowly detect you, but nothing short of attacking someone will make them suspicious of you once you're in a disguise. Running up buildings, jumping over walls, and breaking the land speed record are completely normal abilities, apparently. There's a way to stealthily eat someone, and you can gain the ability to accuse others of being you as a distraction, but for the most part, unless it's absolutely necessary for the objective, it's quicker and more engaging to just toss a truck at your enemies and eat anyone who survives. Stealth only works against the military too. The infected are hostile regardless of your actions. There's not a huge amount of variance amongst the infected, with the most basic being a horde of zombies alongside a few tougher, larger enemies that you actually need to pay attention to. There's enough difference between the military and their vehicles, and the infected and their variants, that the two factions feel satisfyingly different to fight, but the best part of the dual antagonists is when they fight one another. Throughout the game you'll be faced with fighting one or the other or both, sometimes as an ally to one side, sometimes with a shared objective but still hostile. It makes for good variety, and the infighting adds to the chaos of the encounters. The best aspect of the system, however, is how it evolves throughout the game. At the start the city is entirely clean, but as the game progresses the infected outbreak spreads across more and more of the city. Overall, the open world is a little underwhelming. Not awful by any means, but a little lacking in detail, with blocks that make up the city feeling a little repetitive. But the shift from regular city streets to infected war zone as the game progresses does add a dynamic feeling to the game. The gradual shift from a few infected hotspots with military organisation Blackwatch trying to maintain control to a wholesale war across the entire island of Manhattan feels satisfying, and does a good job of conveying the sense of the situation gradually slipping out of control. The player's power will increase faster than the threats will, especially if you take part in even a moderate amount of optional events, but it still does a good job of making the outbreak feel more threatening as the plot advances. Like the Infected and Blackwatch, the game's tone is in constant conflict. Trying to combine the high-octane chaotic whiz-bang gore-soaked combat with a dark conspiracy thriller isn't something it succeeds at, but it certainly tries to early on. At first, the game just about manages to keep the two in check by having Blackwatch's relatively grounded military response fighting against the more fantastical infected monsters, but then it tips the balance over by introducing the super soldiers. From a gameplay perspective, they add a necessary category of enemy between infantry and vehicles for the military, as well as something that can take on heavy infected one-on-one for the larger scale three-way fights. But by introducing equally over-the-top elements to the more grounded side of the conflict, it shifts the tone too far towards comic books and sacrifices the more serious undertones the story was trying to achieve. It doesn't ruin the game by any measure, but it's one of the first and most obvious indications that the game isn't going to reward you for seriously engaging with its plot. Alex starts the game with amnesia, and as would be expected, that means he doesn't have a great deal to go on starting out. His first lead he gets from eating a Blackwatch officer, then moving to arrest his sister. She's already been researching Gentek, Blackwatch's corporate research branch, at Alex's behest, so she's already got plenty of leads to go on. She's a strong presence early in the game, clearly intelligent and capable, but ultimately little more than a way to point you to your next objective. Missions don't always track from their introduction well. Whoever gives you the mission will drop some exposition, point you somewhere, and then Alex will say something barely connected about how it's the key to everything, and the mission starts. Occasionally it'll make sense how it connects to what they told you, other times it won't. The writing overall is as inspired by comic books as the gameplay and setting, which is a problem. The attempt to have an underlying, serious conspiracy going on is constantly undermined by simplistic writing, never able to fully commit to the complexity necessary to get all of the background information conveyed and connected to what you'll be doing. The chaos of the combat has to take centre stage, which always leaves things feeling a little empty. Eventually, Dana will be captured by the Infected, and by the time you rescue her, she's fallen into a coma, at which point she drops out of the narrative and isn't mentioned again. The pacing isn't helped by constantly interrupting the narrative for flash forwards. A lot of the game is framed as Mercer discussing the past fortnight with an unidentified person on a rooftop, deep into the viral outbreak. Each of these segments briefly comments on what happened before, then insists upon how important the next part of the plot will be. Mercer really does declare everything the key to understanding, but it rarely is. Like the mission intros, it doesn't even indicate what you might be doing next. At one point, for example, Mercer brings up McMullen, head researcher at Gentek. Naturally, Alex declares him the key to everything, insists that he learned the truth from him and then he died, but that's not going to happen in the next run of missions. McMullen gets away when you meet him and the focus shifts to other matters. It'll be several more rooftop interludes and a couple of hours before you actually track him down, at which point he reveals very little, though to be fair he does die afterwards, so at least that much was true. There's a very fine balance between keeping a narrative compelling and stringing the audience along, and for me, Prototype strays just slightly too far into the latter. I found myself wanting to engage with the plot, but being frequently frustrated as threads were dropped and answers were unsatisfying. It even led me to question whether some of the more well-executed aspects of the plot were even intentional in the first place. Karen Parker is difficult to pin down, because I don't know if her betrayal is cleverly foreshadowed, or if it was just a function of the objective-focused dialogue. She's Mercer's ex-girlfriend. They met when they were both working at Gentek. She initially seems to be helping you learn more about the virus by collecting samples of its genetic material from various sources, but later she sends you off to be ambushed and injected with an antivirus that shuts down several of your abilities for a few missions, then disappears from the plot. The first time you meet her, however, she's initially shocked Alex is alive, and then tells him to grab a military vehicle for them to escape the infected zone, which is either a subtle indication she already knows what he's capable of, or a tall order for your ex who just dropped back into your life. It's difficult to tell whether this is intentional or not, because none of the characters are written with any amount of depth. Dr. Ragland is an independent doctor who also used to work at Gentech, quit due to ethical issues, but still works with them occasionally when their goals align, which could be interesting, opening the way to complex narrative elements, but like Karen and Dana, he only exists to give you objectives and then be the target of a few frustrating escort missions, before disappearing from the plot, in his case at the same point Dana does. There's nothing better to be found on the antagonist's side either. McMullen, Randall, Taggart, Cross each add little beyond their role in the plot. The doctor in charge of Gentech, the grizzled general overseeing Blackwatch, none of them actually add any narrative weight, and are instead simply there to exposit and set up objectives before it's time for them to be killed. This lack of character complexity is particularly egregious when it comes to the woman who turns out to be controlling the infected, Elizabeth Green. Green is the source of the virus, in a way. She was one of the only 2 survivors of a previous outbreak, but she was still infected. Blackwatch kept her imprisoned for decades, all the while extracting various strains of the virus from her for Gentech to experiment on, either for medical research, for biological enhancements, or even for the development of biological weapons. Every strain of the virus, from the one that filled the streets with zombies to the one that lets Mercer shapeshift by eating people, stems from Green. Green was an innocent civilian before her infection. She didn't ask for what happened to her, and yet everything that happened in the game started from research done upon her without her consent, which leads to a slightly bizarre real-world analogue, if you'll allow me the tangent. In 1951, an African-American woman named Henrietta Lacks died of cervical cancer. She was just 31 at the time. She sought treatment at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. During her treatment, while under a general anaesthetic, without her knowledge or consent, a biopsy was performed on one of her tumours, as well as healthy cells from her cervix, and delivered to George Otto Guy. Guy was researching ways of preserving cell cultures, and until then had been having little luck. Cells naturally divide and create copies of themselves a number of times before dying. Cancer is what happens when they continue to divide and create copies beyond that, but outside of the human body, even these cells will quickly die out. Not Henrietta's cells, though. The cells taken from Henrietta's tumour continue to grow in Guy's culture medium, unlike anything before them. These cultures, entitled HeLa, became the first line of immortal human cells, a cell culture that could be continuously grown and divided and regrown without them dying out. Guy would share these cells with others, who would continue to grow more and share more. The development of the HeLa cell line is one of, if not the, most important event in modern medicine. Laboratories around the world use cells of this line, all descended from that biopsy, in research to this day. They have been used in discoveries from the creation of the polio vaccine to the development of IVF treatments, from research into cancer to work that underpinned the Human Genome Project. They've even been sent into orbit aboard satellites to study the effects of space travel on living cells and tissue. Henrietta Lacks would never know the effect her cells would have on the world. She likely never even knew they were taken. Her family didn't find out until 1975, 24 years after Henrietta died, by which point the cells were already being used all across the world in research that would both save lives and make people rich. Lax's contribution to the world was huge, but so too is the controversy surrounding it. Naturally, the story involves a great deal of moral complexity. True, her cells have done and continue to do unquestionable good in the world, but based on actions performed without her knowledge, consent, or benefit. Fictional though she may be, Green's story isn't unlike Lax's in its potential for moral complexity. Infected without her knowledge, held against her will, and even having a child, the other survivor of the previous outbreak, taken from her, Green has the potential to be an incredibly engaging aspect of the plot. She isn't. She's initially offered as a mystery, another thread to pull on to help uncover the conspiracy, but from the moment she's released from her prison to the moment she's killed by Mercer in Times Square, Green will never be treated as anything more than a monster. She's a generic villain, vague in her motivations and never portrayed as sympathetic or complex despite her potential to be both. She's just a woman who makes more and more monsters before turning into one herself and being killed. Despite how important she may seem to proceedings, she isn't even particularly present in the narrative, just a vague threat in the background amongst the more directly visible antagonists among Blackwatch, such as Cross. Robert Cross starts out as a pretty generic agent within the plot, but eventually evolves into one of its most confusing and muddled aspects instead. When he's first introduced, he's just a high-ranking member of Blackwatch, and seems to be being set up as a major boss, which he is. Later, however, he turns out to be the initially unidentified figure Alex is talking to on the rooftop throughout the game. Shortly after the midpoint of the game, he starts leaking information to Mercer through dead drops, helping him defeat Blackwatch's plans, though he never really provides any indication as to why he's doing so. Eventually he aids Mercer in accessing the aircraft carrier offshore from which Blackwatch intends to nuke New York, and end the outbreak that way. This is where things turn into a mess. Eating the general in charge reveals Elizabeth Green had her child taken from her, at which point Mercer accuses Cross of knowing about everything all along. Cross then admits his plan to consume Mercer and transforms into his infected form, ready for the final boss. The undeniable implication of the timing of this reveal, and Mercer's epiphany concerning Cross, is that Cross is Elizabeth's child. He is not, though. Or he might be? It's incredibly unclear, and that's the problem. I checked Prototype's fan wiki to double check I didn't miss something, and the discussion tabs feature pages of heated debates as to whether or not he is the child or not, with people even referencing the official Prima Guide, a book that is very much not written by the game's developers, to try and prove their side of the argument. Cross transforms into either a or the Supreme Hunter, a boss you defeated earlier in the game. The one you fought earlier was created by Elizabeth and is shown to have survived in some form, so it may be the same one. Either Cross is the Supreme Hunter, not the child, and the real Cross was killed off-screen at some point, and the reveal is terribly timed to make it look like he's something else, or Cross is the child, and the devs simply reused the Supreme Hunter for the final boss. I choose to believe the latter. Cross being the child works a lot better from a thematic viewpoint, having been set up as Mercer's equal amongst Blackwatch, though it would make the idea that the other Supreme Hunter you fought survived meaningless, and contradicts some minor lore hidden away in the background. Either way, the repeated boss fight is a weak mechanical climax to the game. This handling of Cross is the best example of the shortcomings of the game's modes of narrative delivery. It wants to feel like a slow burn conspiracy thriller, but has to dedicate so much of its focus to the combat and gameplay loops that it doesn't have the time to fully flesh out the conspiracy. The web of intrigue is a good idea in theory. Alex's ability to gain people's memories through eating them plays well with the game's combination of conspiracy thriller plot and wanton violence gameplay. Neither works particularly well in execution, though. From a mechanical perspective, the web acts as little more than a series of collectibles. Many of the memories are acquired during primary missions, each of which will allow access to the memories attached to it, but you can't deliberately hunt down the optional memories. There's no way to track a specific memory. Instead, you just wander around until you find an icon on your map indicating someone who has a memory, then eat them. Some optional side content makes these easier to find. Military bases will often have one alongside some enemies which will increase your proficiency with military equipment, but the specific memory you get from each seems to be randomized. You just need to keep detouring to the icons on your minimap as they appear and acquiring random memories. This makes it impossible to pull at specific threads that might interest you, lessening the sense of uncovering a conspiracy and making it feel more like a checklist. This wouldn't be so much of a problem, but eating these people doesn't even give you a great deal of narrative to chew upon. There are times when it feels like it may be building to something, but this never really pays off. Almost every major aspect of the conspiracy is uncovered throughout the critical path, and what little isn't included there feels inconsequential. Want to know Elizabeth Green's origin, or the actual identity of her child? Tough luck. Here's a bunch of memories detailing the strain of the virus that was used to create the super soldiers. Not sure why you'd want to know that, but here you go. It was DX1120. Doesn't that feel revelatory? Ultimately, despite how much information there is in there, the web is meaningless. Like Mercer's constant insistence that the next thing he's going after is the key, it always feels like you're one or two memories away from some great revelation, but even if you finish the whole thing, none ever arrive. Just unsatisfying answers to unasked questions. There's only really one aspect of the plot that doesn't unfold more or less how you'd expect it to, and it's how Alex ended up in this mess in the first place. The amnesia doesn't do a whole lot to enhance the sense of uncovering a conspiracy, but it hides the simple fact that Mercer releasing Elizabeth Green wasn't the start of the outbreak. Ironically, while Mercer feeling guilty for letting Green out is dumb, due to the fact that she appeared to be minutes away from escaping on her own, he's still responsible for the outbreak. Alex released the virus deliberately at Penn Station. The fragmented delivery makes specifics hard to parse, but Mercer, either planning to whistleblow himself or anxious about crackdowns around others, stole a vial of the virus while working for Gentek and made a run for it. He was cornered by Blackwatch and deliberately released the virus, presumably out of spite, which matches his characterization throughout the game of just being kind of a dick. The other part of the twist is that you aren't playing as Alex Mercer at all. Getting a full dose of the virus by smashing it at his feet killed him by consuming him just as you've been doing to others all game long. The virus took his form and most of his memories, and as the only set of memories that it had at the time, awoke assuming it was him. As you consumed others throughout the game, you gained their memories, but Alex remained the baseline that the sentient mass of biogoop was using as a personality. The game doesn't really get much of a chance to tackle this plot point, unfortunately. The script pays lip service to the idea that the protagonist isn't really Mercer anymore, given that he also contains the memories of the hundreds, if not thousands of people he ate during his rampage through New York, but only during the final cutscene, so it never really gets to expand upon the concept. After the fight with Cross or the Supreme Hunter, whichever you choose to believe, Mercer uses a helicopter to drop the nuke that's aimed at levelling the city far offshore, saving the day. It's assumed by the military that he was killed in the blast, but he managed to bail out at the last minute, reconstituting from his goop form and sneaking off into the night to wrestle with what he is now. Without Green and Cross to lead them, the remaining infected in the city lose their drive and become little more than a mindless rabble, easy for Blackwatch to clean up without resorting to nuclear fire. You never get a more fleshed out examination of what it might mean for Mercer to now know he's not human, but a sentient virus holding the memories of hundreds, each of which end with death by its own hand. Despite this, it's still a decent enough ending. It's both a satisfying and conclusive ending to the narrative at work, while leaving enough questions open both about Mercer's character and the background conspiracy to keep the option of a sequel open. A sequel that would come 3 years later, in 2012. A common issue with game sequels is power creep. By the end of the first game, the virus formerly known as Alex Mercer is so powerful that it doesn't really leave a sequel any room to grow. Naturally, the solution is to pick a new protagonist, which in this case is James Heller. Heller is an ex-Marine, but while he was away from New York, a second outbreak occurred in which his wife and daughter were killed. Told that this second outbreak was caused by Alex Mercer, Heller rejoins the military and volunteers for the dangerous patrols of the Red Zone. This, of course, goes wrong. Heller confronts Mercer and is infected with the same strain as him. Mercer tells him it was Blackwatch that was responsible for the outbreak, and that Heller should seek his own answers with his newly granted powers. It's a good starting point for the game, a new mystery to uncover with a new protagonist to reset the power curve. The revenge angle is a little trite, all things considered, but it's not the weakest aspect of Heller's character. Heller is perpetually angry at everything, and almost everyone. Under other circumstances, this characterization might just be a little grating, but Heller is African American. There's a long history of black people, men especially, being portrayed as overly aggressive and quick to anger. Worse, like many stereotypes, it isn't just limited to media, but is regularly applied to real people, with this assumption further pushing false narratives of black individuals being more dangerous, a narrative that acts as one of the many, many supporting factors leading to black people facing not only discrimination, but wildly disproportionate use of force against them by the police, not just in the USA, but in many white majority countries globally. The concept of the angry black man is an actively dangerous stereotype that has contributed to the deaths of many people, so to see it so casually presented here is very disappointing. One of the only people Heller isn't perpetually angry at is Father Guerra. Heller seeks him out shortly after being set loose on the streets of New York. He runs a church in the neighbourhood Heller used to live in. It feels like the intention was to have Guerra act as something of a conscience for Heller, but for that to have worked, it would probably have required Guerra spending less time giving Heller a list of people to murder. You can't even make a defense that Heller is acting without his knowledge. Guerra seems fully aware of Heller's preferences when it comes to problem solving, and shows little regard for the outcomes. It's clear he's trying to help people, and there's some sense that he feels like he's committing the lesser evil by aiding Heller, but his only real attempt to dissuade Heller from his path is a warning not to lose himself, a sentiment that is ultimately meaningless as he follows this up by pointing Heller towards a Blackwatch military base to rampage through, and then getting murdered by Alex Mercer shortly afterwards. It's not really a big surprise that Mercer turns heel after the first third of the game. He was introduced as a villain and is only really seen as an absentee ally for long enough to justify him having given Heller his powers in the first place. To Heller's credit, he doesn't wait for Mercer to reveal himself as evil. There's a moment where Mercer starts talking about the plan to defeat Blackwatch and then totally get rid of the virus, which I genuinely thought the game was going to try to play at face value for a while. But while Heller agrees with Alex in the moment, he immediately calls Guerra afterwards to tell him Mercer's full of shit and they can't trust him anymore. Like last time, it actually was Mercer who started this outbreak. It seems his plan overall is to kill off all the humans while creating a new race of infected like him and Heller, called the Evolved. Making him a villain has the potential to work well. The previous game left off with a question mark as to what he was going to become, with his history allowing for either a protagonistic or antagonistic role going forwards. The only problem is, he's a massive dork. Amnesia and the player's control meant Alex didn't get a great deal of characterization in the first game. More time was spent discovering who he was than actually considering how that person might act. But separated from the player's control, he needs to actually be a character. The character he landed on was mustache-twirling emo villain, which really emphasises how dumb the character's design of a jacket over a hoodie over a dress shirt was, even before popping both available collars. You could possibly excuse that in the first game as being what a guy with a PhD would think is cool and edgy given the circumstances, but Heller also features a massive popped collar on his design, so it seems the dev just liked the aesthetic. Mercer's villainous monologues don't quite work either. They either needed to be toned down to feel more grounded, or hammed way the hell up to be fun, but they land in an unhappy middle ground that's too silly to take seriously, but not silly enough to be a good time. Fortunately, other changes to the game are improvements. The gameplay has been tightened considerably, and mostly for the better. Navigation feels a little floaty, but it's easier to get Heller to go where you want him to. Meanwhile, the combat has been streamlined considerably. Instead of switching between specific attack transformations, you equip two at a time, though each has fewer attacks available. This mixing and matching lets you deal with more situations without having to switch constantly, while still letting you quickly switch in more specialised moves when you need them. Defensive moves have been switched to constantly available parries and dodges, as well as a few extras such as being able to turn people into living bombs before throwing them. Stealth has also been tightened with the ability to stealth consume someone being more readily available and clearer indications when you can do so, and who has line of sight to stop you. It still has the problem of needing to constantly come up with narrative reasons you can't just tear your way through the bases, but at least Blackwatch have been subjected to a few OPSEC seminars this time around, so they do become suspicious of any of their compatriots suddenly sprinting up walls, though they're still pretty slow on the uptake. A lot of the changes facilitate a fundamental shift in the makeup of combat encounters. There's a greater range of tougher enemies, so one-on-one combat or fighting small groups of tough opponents is emphasised, while the larger scale fights between weaker opponents act as background noise and healthy snacks. To this end, attacks are more easily targetable, while also having a wider range for dealing with the more numerous weaker foes. The system manages to maintain the hectic and chaotic feel of the previous game, while also being more focused and controllable. Despite having a more limited range of moves and combos, it no longer gives the sense of flailing wildly, making combat feel more intentional, which is a change I'm in favour of, even if it did result in the cutting of my favourite transformation, which just beefed up your basic moveset and let you hurl bystanders hard enough to knock helicopters out of the sky. Upgrading your abilities has also been massively improved. Instead of a global point system, XP from killing enemies and completing missions only lets you improve a limited number of basic stats, how much health you have or your movement speed, for example. Transformations and equipment abilities are upgraded through eating specific enemies. Meanwhile, more impactful upgrades to your movement, combat or defensive abilities are tied directly to optional missions and collectibles. Each set you complete lets you choose from a list of upgrades to that specific ability, which not only makes improvements feel better paced out, but also encourages exploration and interaction with side content, since each are both more varied and more directly impactful in improving your abilities. This also leads to greater interaction with one of the game's greatest improvements, and that is New York itself. When I initially heard Prototype 2's map was to be split into 3 smaller areas, I was skeptical. One of the best parts of the original game was having a large open map to run around in, and I thought reducing that to a series of smaller, more confined areas would detract from that experience. What I wasn't expecting was how much that change would improve the quality of the areas overall. Prototype's Manhattan was large, but also a little bland when it came down to it. City blocks were more or less indistinguishable from one another. Streets were busy with pedestrians, but felt barren in terms of environmental detail. It was only really the expanding red zones throughout the game that made the city feel alive and active. Prototype 2's setup fixes all of the problems the first game had, without sacrificing too much of that sense of expanding chaos from the loss of the growing infected zones. The 3 zones are labelled green, yellow and red, and theoretically exist in an escalating level of infection. The truth is more narratively interesting, however. The yellow zone you start in is an openly Blackwatch controlled area, but the infected outbreaks in the zone are deliberate. Blackwatch use the area as a testing ground, and are constantly releasing different types of infected to see the effects on the local populace. It's a run-down zone full of homeless encampments and shantytowns, spotted with Blackwatch outposts to keep the populace in line. From the start of the game, the area feels more lived in and real than any of the previous game's environments, despite Blackwatch's shift from their previously grounded military aesthetic to a more overtly sci-fi inspired set of uniforms complete with LED lights and glowing eyes. The green zone, by comparison, is supposedly safe, but is actually less well controlled than the yellow. The shops and roads are still open, it still appears like people are living normally in the area, but Blackwatch are constantly fighting infected incursions from the underground system. Even beyond the improvements in graphics and environmental detail, the differences between the yellow zone's run-down refugee camps and the relatively functional green zones give the game a lot more environmental variety than the first game, and even though the areas are smaller, the landmarks within them stand out more. You spend about a third of the game in each zone, starting in the yellow, helping with Father Guerra combat Blackwatch's research on the helpless populace, then to investigate Mercer's plans in the green zone. Mercer's evolved add a nice bit of spice to the combat encounters. At any point, a group of easily dispatched Blackwatch grunts could turn out to be dangerous infected, matching Hela in terms of speed and strength. Dropping out of the sky onto someone to eat them, only for them to toss you across the street and sprout sword arms, is a pretty fun switch up. Mercer has agents infiltrating many levels of Blackwatch, twisting their research to his own, equally nefarious ends, and uncovering the dual intertwined plans of Blackwatch and Mercer's infiltrators does make for a more engaging plot than the first game, but not by a great deal. The plans still have the unsatisfying combination of being both too convoluted and too simplistic at the same time. Characters on both sides of the conspiracy tend to have the same problem as the first game, where they're pretty one-note, such as Chief of Research Dr. Koenig, who turns out to be one of Mercer's men, and Colonel Rooks, a Blackwatch commander, who is genuinely trying to stem the tide of the infection, despite using a heavy and uncaring hand to do so. One of the more interesting is Galloway, Blackwatch's new CFO, and it initially appears one of Mercer's plants. Unlike Koenig and the rest of Mercer's Evolved, Galloway isn't particularly dedicated to their cause. There's the implication that Alex has some kind of sway over the Evolved, allowing him to actively control them, but Hela appears to be immune to this, and Galloway is too. She's working for Mercer, another of his sleeper agents within Blackwatch, but she doesn't appear to be that interested in doing his bidding. For this reason, she's willing to work with Hela to some degree, giving him leads on the other members of the Evolved for him to take out, eventually even offering to work together on a more permanent basis. The problem is, she appears to have absolutely no motivation. A lot of the characters throughout the game are flat, but at least they seem to have some sense of why they're doing what they are. Galloway, meanwhile, doesn't show any indication as to what she actually wants from working with Mercer or Hela. This leads to the baffling shift, where Galloway switches her allegiance back to Mercer in the final few missions, for no reason other than Hela was rude to her. To be fair, this was a completely unforced error on Hela's part. As scheming and conniving in Galloway is in demeanour, she's pretty straight with him throughout the game, and there's really no reason for him to be quite so aggressive to her, beyond it reinforcing his general air of scowling contempt for anyone who isn't entirely submitting to his wishes. Colonel Rooks also has an interesting role in the plot, though it is a messy one too. He becomes an obvious early target, but instead of killing him, Hela eats his second-in-command. Therefore, throughout the plot, Rooks will call you to lay out his plans, letting you disrupt them instead. Clearly, Blackwatch's OPSEC seminars weren't thorough enough. It constantly feels like it's going to hit a moment where it's revealed Rooks worked out you're an imposter and sends you into a trap, but he never does. He's also the one enemy in the game that Hela actually sees as human, but that's played out even worse. A late game twist reveals that Hela's daughter didn't die in the outbreak. For reasons unclear, Blackwatch picked her up and wants to experiment on her. Mercer similarly wants to capture her, since he seems to think whatever genetic quirk that means he can't control Hela will be present and exploitable in her. Finding and rescuing Hela's daughter becomes his primary motivation during the final part of the game, but it also stops him from killing Rooks. At the moment he's planning to, Rooks happens to be on the phone with his own wife and mentions his daughter, and this is enough for Hela to stay his hand. This is the kind of epiphany that feels like it would be interesting on paper, but this is a man who has slaughtered his way through countless men and women at this point, and eaten a fair number to gain their memories to boot. The idea that this would suddenly give him pause, like he would suddenly realise these were actually people this late in the game, feels ridiculous. It's melodramatic for melodrama's sake, and isn't particularly earned through the narrative running up to it. Rooks even returns the favour, kind of. He captures Hela's daughter, locks her down, lets Hela murder a huge number of his men to get to her, and then kills a couple of his own men to let him take her away anyway, despite having spent the entire game trying to kill Hela at all costs. It's a twist for the sake of a twist, and doesn't even matter to the plot, given that's the moment that Hela being an arsehole to everyone comes back to bite him, and Galloway steals his daughter out from under his nose and delivers her to Mercer for a final showdown. She'll feel bad about it though later, just before she's killed. All this late game plot happens in the Red Zone. While the first two zones are based on parts of New York I'm not familiar with, and as far as I can tell are amalgamations of a few different districts, the Red Zone is the same, albeit smaller Manhattan from the first game. The zone now only stretches from Battery Park to Times Square, with Central Park and beyond being completely engulfed in flames. Covering the same space as the first game might have made it the least interesting zone, but the direct comparison to what came before allows it to be the starkest example of the improvements over its predecessor, making the return to Manhattan one of the game's highlights. Manhattan has been almost completely engulfed in chaos, and the streets are swamped with infected. The handful of military bases act as constant zones of conflict. Meanwhile, Blackwatch patrols throughout the zone means you're always just a few blocks away from a major firefight. Even when you aren't directly in conflict, it's clear a great deal has happened before your arrival. Infected growths twist between buildings, and entire skyscrapers are falling into one another. Despite the scale of the devastation wrought upon the area, though, it isn't completely deserted. The rooftops are still occupied by the last remnants of the civilian population, hiding from Blackwatch as much as they are hiding from the infected. The improved level of detail and variation in the game's environments are most noticeable here due to the direct comparison to the same areas as the last game. It feels more like a setting and less like a backdrop. There's clearer delineation between areas like Times Square and Chinatown, and despite taking up less space, it feels like there's more to explore. It's also where the graphical improvements are most noticeable. In the first few zones, the improved level of detail, variation, and graphical fidelity are apparent, but it's the red zone that reveals the most unexpectedly impactful advancement. The atmospheric fog added and exaggerated in the game add a sense of scale unlike anything in the first game. I think the streets are slightly narrower and the buildings taller, but it's the fog that really sells the experience of scale that the first game was retrospectively missing. Being at street level genuinely makes you feel penned in as the skyscrapers tower above you. Meanwhile, jumping from building to building feels like an entirely different world from the chaos happening down below. While I expect there are genuine differences in the scale on top of this, it's really the fog that sells the feeling, hiding the streets as you leap from rooftop to rooftop while making those rooftops feel distant while fighting at street level. It's such a subtle shift, but it really sells the sense of exploring a city rather than an approximation of one. You're prompted to enter the red zone after Father Guerra's death at Mercer's hand, when an underground contact he's mentioned throughout the game, Athena, makes contact with Hela. Despite the added complication of Hela's daughter, there isn't really a major difference in the kinds of mission you'll be performing, but the introduction of Athena is a welcome one, since it's picking up a thread dropped by the last game. Athena is Dana Mercer. Apparently, after waking up from the coma she was so unceremoniously left in at the end of the last game, Dana picked up right where she left off, and went back to investigating Blackwatch. Since the first outbreak, however, she has expanded her operations to organising the resistance against Blackwatch's occupation of New York, and added fighting her ex-brother to the list ever since he released the second outbreak. Dana's as strong and determined as she was in the first game, but she's more accustomed to the life now. There's an underlying sense that she's acting out of a sense of guilt for helping Alex the first go-around, feeling partly responsible for his rise to power and being able to release the second outbreak, but at the same time, she's not acting because of that guilt. She's acting because it's the right thing to do and she can do it. She's a welcome presence, and is a more natural fit as someone organising and directing your missions than Guerra, since she didn't have the same disconnect between what she says and what she's asking you to do. She's been organising people this way for a while, you just happen to have scary monster claws, which means she can send you on harder missions. That said, cramming her into the back third of the game does make the relationship between Hela and Dana feel rushed. She gets a little more screen time since she's also a supporting character in side missions, something that couldn't be done with Guerra since he might die before you go back to do them, but the shift from Hela being angry and suspicious of her to asking her to take care of his daughter if anything happens to him happens over the course of a few in-game days. It feels a tad out of character for Hela, and only really works from a player perspective if you've had the first 2/3 of the previous game to also get to know Dana. I trust Dana as a player, but Hela has little reason to do so. Certainly not to the point of appointing her guardian of his daughter. Though, to the writer's credit, even Dana seems to think this is a pretty sudden shift in their relationship, despite ultimately agreeing. Besides that, there's no real attempt to set Hela and Dana up as a couple. They're good friends much quicker than you'd expect them to be, but there's no out-of-place romantic undertones. Galloway flirts with Hella a bit, but that's more of a function of her being an evil, manipulative woman, which is certainly another overly worn-out trope, but overall I appreciate that the game resists the urge to have every female character throwing themselves at the player. Eventually, all Hella and Dana's work together culminates in a final confrontation with Alex. The final few missions feel like they're trying to wrap up too many plot threads too quickly, but they're not without their redeeming features. Rook's inexplicable trap using Hella's daughter only to let him walk away after all the men he's killed, followed by Galloway's woman-scorned heel turn of stealing the daughter from Mercer, certainly feel like a hasty attempt to build to a climax, but it's not helped by Mercer needing to throw together one last villain monologue to badly explain why he wants the kid in the first place. It also doesn't help that the ability Hella will use to conclude the narrative is only set up moments before the final boss, when Mercer mass consumes his cadre of Evolved, including Galloway, to power up before the fight. The fight itself is at least satisfying. The first game's repeated final boss was pretty irritating to fight, but Mercer is a fitting climactic spectacle. He switches between various combat forms and abilities, and you need to switch yourself to counter them. Once you establish how the fight works, it's a tad on the easy side, but it's a good use of the mechanical toolset the game has been building. Unfortunately, while the mechanical climax is an improvement over the first game, the narrative climax is not. The first game's quiet and pensive ending, taking a moment to reconsider what Mercer is, now he knows he isn't human, but also has the memories of all that he's consumed, was compelling. Here, the ending is a quick Deus Ex Machina followed by a question mark. Hella consumes Mercer, then explodes, simultaneously consuming every single infected in the city, ending the infection in an instant. He rescues Dana and his daughter, and then the three stand on a rooftop while Dana asks, "Now what?" Now what indeed? You'd think Hella, now having not only his own memories, but also those of everyone he's eaten, and Mercer, and everyone Mercer's has eaten, would change a man. But given it took him listening in on a phone call to realise other people might have daughters too, I wouldn't put him past him to be totally unaffected by the experience. In either case, the actual now what can be answered in the real world. Despite solid sales, Activision would be unsatisfied with the game's performance. Developer Radical Entertainment would face significant layoffs and be relegated to a support studio for other Activision titles, no longer able to work on their own projects. Whether they're still active in some form deep in the Destiny or Call of Duty mines is difficult to say. The prototype games aren't bad by any means, but they were slightly outdated even at the time. The chaotic superhero-inspired sandbox gameplay is fun by all means, but there's little narrative weight behind it, and the attempts to make the game feel darker and more mature were underdeveloped and added little to the experience. They do feel, in many ways, more like throwbacks to older superhero games, rather than advancements in the genre. The original prototype is often remembered as having come out the same year as similar comic book-inspired superhero sandbox game Infamous, but that series would have better luck with modernising and maturing the concept through narrative means, even if the action and combat were less bombastic overall. The third prototype game was cancelled when Radical was moved into a supporting role, and it would have been interesting to see where they went with it. Maybe that one could have even passed the Bechdel test, but I doubt it would have pushed the genre forward any more than its predecessors had. Probably would have been good fun though. Thanks for watching.